Good afternoon, and welcome to our Lent reflections. Sorry, we're running a little behind this week. We actually scheduled these for 12 noon, but we're being flexible with all of that, and time is fluid. Thank you for joining us, and how about we begin with a prayer? God of infinite love, we ask that you bless our time with your Spirit. Allow our Lenten journey to be one in which we grow closer in our imitation of Jesus, your child. We ask this in your loving name. Amen. What I'd like to do with this first reflection is kind of piece together the readings from this past Sunday. Primarily Genesis, the story of the temptation of Adam and Eve, and the ultimate entering of what is referred to as sin into the world, and Jesus' temptation in the desert. They kind of parallel one another. Very briefly, in Matthew's temptation in the desert, Jesus is tempted by Satan or the tempter or the devil, and the temptations revolve around basic human nature. Wanting food, wanting wealth, wanting power, wanting prestige. And Jesus' response to each of the three temptations is that of referring to the scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures, and ultimately saying, no, I'm not going to fall for the false promise. Instead, I'm going to hold true to what I believe, and obviously does not enter into turning away from the faithfulness to Yahweh our God, but instead continues to be faithful to the ministry of proclaiming the good news. When we contrast that with the account in Genesis, we have a very, very different encounter. In Genesis, we have all of creation created out of love, and ultimately all of creation exists in perfect harmony. Humankind is created in the image and likeness of the all-loving God, and all of creation is there for humankind to enjoy. Then we are introduced to Satan, or the devil, or the tempter, who basically says, okay, look, God gave you all of this, but also said you can't do this. Ultimately, the story tells us that Satan, or the devil, basically told Adam and Eve that the whole thing about not eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil is that God doesn't want you to be like God. Ultimately, false words. Instead, God simply said, just don't eat from this one tree. Don't touch it. Don't go near it. Leave it alone. Everything else, the whole rest of the world, is all yours. Enjoy it. But what the authors in Genesis do is set up that there's just one little stipulation, one instruction God gave those first humans. You can enjoy everything. Just don't eat from this tree or go near it. And that's the one thing that the tempter or devil or Satan basically says, yeah, why did God say that? And puts into the minds of Adam and Eve the concept of wanting to be even more than what God created them with. Ultimately, free choice is explained. God didn't create us as robots or automatons, but instead, God gave us free choice. And with that free choice, ultimately with every decision that we make, there are either positive or negative consequences with each and every action, every word, anything that we do. It either has a positive or a negative. And in terms of the Genesis story, obviously the outcome or the consequence is disobedience, resulting in humankind then being tossed out of paradise, perfect relationship with God and all of creation, and the ripple effect of those consequences start. You're going to find that life is no longer going to just be perfect. It's fascinating when we look at the different authors in Genesis, what become part of those storylines. In our reading from Sunday, it finished up with, and their eyes were opened, and they realized that they were naked, and then sewed leaves together to cover themselves. What does that introduce? Shame. What does that introduce? Different needs that were never there before. And that ripples out then. Just a few words later, Genesis then tells us, God says, I will place enmity between your offspring and the devil's offspring. You will strike at his heel, he will strike at your heel, and you will strike at his head. Ultimately, that there will always be now this ongoing conflict because of the choices that were made and the consequences that then ripple out. Just give that some thought for a couple of minutes. Living in perfect harmony with the world around us. All of our needs were met, everything was taken care of, everything was wonderful. And then humankind made the decision not to listen to God, but instead to listen to a false voice. And the consequences start to ripple out. We start to have pain. We have suffering. We have illness. We have the needs that society then begins to set up. And ultimately, with that pain and suffering comes death. But Genesis doesn't just leave it with a horrible, terrible ending. Instead, God promises that there will ultimately be reconciliation, and that the creation that was created in perfect harmony will be restored, and that restoration ultimately comes about through the life, passion, death, resurrection of Jesus the Christ, who becomes then that perfect human being. Rather than buying into the temptations, Jesus instead continues to be faithful to the promise of God and continues to be faithful to the mission and ministry of proclaiming the good news of God's unconditional love. Possibly over the course of this week, then, think about temptation and consequences, and think about how God's creation can be restored through our own actions, through our own words, and what we are able to do through our trying to imitate the life, the actions, the words of Jesus can bring about that reconciliation and the ultimate fulfillment of God's plan of restoring all into harmony and peace and love as everything had been created, was intended by God, and ultimately will be restored by God. Hope this has been beneficial and meaningful for you, and hopefully you'll join us next week for another Lenten reflection. Have a great day. God bless. Bye-bye.